Mr. Leonard Gray was a man everyone in town admired. At 78 years old, he had lived a long and eventful life. Known for his kindness and generosity, Leonard had donated millions to schools, hospitals, and local charities. Despite his immense wealth, he lived a simple life. He loved taking quiet evening walks across the town's old stone bridge, enjoying the cool breeze and the sound of the river flowing below. Leonard was a firm believer in staying connected to the world around him. He never traveled with bodyguards or fancy cars. Instead, he preferred to greet people with a warm smile and chat with anyone who stopped to say hello. This evening was no different. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Leonard put on his coat and left his house for his usual walk. Meanwhile, a little boy named Ethan was also outside, though he wasn't supposed to be. Ethan was 8 years old, curious about everything, and always seeking adventure. He loved exploring the world around him, especially places his parents told him not to go. That evening, he decided to sneak out with his dog, Max, to explore the area near the bridge. The bridge was a magical place for Ethan. It was old, with large stone arches and vines growing along its sides. He loved how the water shimmered in the fading light and the sound of crickets chirping in the bushes nearby. Hiding behind a tree, Ethan watched as Mr. Leonard walked onto the bridge. Leonard stopped midway, leaning on the rail to admire the view. The stars were beginning to appear in the sky, twinkling like tiny diamonds. He took a deep breath, savoring the peaceful moment. To Leonard, this bridge was more than just a path across the river. It was a place where he could think, dream, and reflect on his life. Ethan crouched quietly with Max beside him, careful not to make a sound. He didn't want Mr. Leonard to know he was there. Watching the old man enjoy the evening made Ethan feel a strange sense of calm. In that moment, the bridge felt like a safe, magical place where nothing bad could ever happen. But something about the evening felt slightly off. Ethan noticed a figure moving in the shadows, further down the bridge. It was a man, dressed in dark clothes, walking toward Mr. Leonard. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure why, but something about the man made him uneasy. Max let out a soft whimper, sensing Ethan's tension. Leonard, lost in his thoughts, didn't seem to notice the man approaching. Ethan stayed perfectly still, watching the scene unfold. The man stopped a few feet behind Leonard, his expression hidden in the dim light. Ethan wasn't sure what to do. Should he call out? Should he run for help? He felt frozen, unsure if what he was seeing was important, or if he was just imagining things. He gripped Max's leash tightly, his young mind racing with questions. The peaceful evening on the bridge was about to change, and Ethan didn't know that his quiet adventure would lead to something far bigger than he could have imagined. The man in dark clothes moved closer to Mr. Leonard Gray, his footsteps barely audible against the stone bridge. Ethan crouched low, hiding behind the tree at the edge of the bridge, his heart pounding in his chest. Max, his loyal dog, sat beside him, sensing Ethan's unease. The man stopped just a few steps away from Leonard, and for a moment there was silence, broken only by the gentle sound of the river below. Leonard, still leaning on the rail, finally turned around. At first he seemed surprised to see someone there, but being the kind man he was, Leonard greeted the stranger with a polite smile. "Good evening," Leonard said, his voice warm and friendly. "Lovely night for a walk, isn't it?" The man didn't respond right away. He seemed tense, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his coat. Leonard noticed this, but didn't let it bother him. He believed in giving everyone the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps the man was having a bad day or was simply lost in thought. "I often come here to clear my mind," Leonard continued, trying to start a conversation. "The sound of the river has a way of putting things into perspective, don't you think?" The man finally looked up, his face partially hidden by the shadows. "Perspective," he said, his voice low and strained. "Some people don't have the luxury of peaceful walks or quiet reflections." Leonard tilted his head slightly, sensing the bitterness in the man's tone. "I suppose life isn't always fair," Leonard replied gently. "But kindness and understanding can make a difference, even in the toughest times." Ethan, watching from his hiding spot, felt a strange mix of curiosity and fear. He didn't understand the man's words, but he could tell something wasn't right. The way the man spoke, the way he stood, it was as if he carried a heavy weight on his shoulders. Ethan wanted to run and tell someone, but a part of him couldn't look away. The man took a step closer to Leonard, his hands still in his pockets. "You speak of kindness," he said, his voice growing sharper. "But do you really understand what it's like to have nothing? To watch others thrive while you struggle to survive?" Leonard's expression softened with concern. "I may not know your struggles," he said, "but I've always believed in helping where I can. If you need help, I'm here to listen." For a moment, the man seemed taken aback by Leonard's words. He hesitated, as if unsure of how to respond. But the bitterness inside him was too deep, too consuming. He stepped even closer, and Ethan could feel the tension in the air. "Help," the man said with a bitter laugh. "You think words can fix everything." Ethan clutched Max's leash tightly, his young mind racing. He wanted to do something, anything, to stop whatever was about to happen. But he felt small and powerless, hidden in the shadows. Leonard, sensing the man's pain, tried to reach out to him. "Sometimes words are a start," he said gently. "What you do next is what truly matters." The man's expression shifted, a storm of emotions playing across his face. Ethan held his breath, watching as the moment hung in fragile balance. Would the man walk away, or would the tension on the bridge take a darker turn? Ethan didn't know, but deep inside, he felt the weight of a decision that wasn't his to make. The air on the bridge felt heavy, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Ethan stayed hidden, his eyes wide as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. The man in the dark coat stood close to Mr. Leonard, his face a mix of anger and sadness. Ethan didn't know what their conversation was about, but he could tell it wasn't friendly. Max whimpered softly, and Ethan placed a calming hand on his dog's head, silently urging him to stay quiet. The man took a deep breath and spoke again, his voice trembling with emotion. "Do you even know what it's like to lose everything? To watch your dreams crumble while people like you live in comfort?" he said, his hands still buried in his coat pockets. Leonard, calm as always, nodded thoughtfully. "Life isn't easy for any of us," he replied. "But blaming others won't bring you peace. It only keeps the pain alive." The man's jaw tightened. "Easy for you to say," he muttered. "You've never had to fight for survival." Leonard stepped back slightly, leaning on the bridge rail. "You'd be surprised," he said quietly. "I faced my share of struggles. But I learned long ago that anger can destroy you if you let it." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to do something, but he didn't know what. The man didn't look like he wanted to listen. His clenched fists and sharp tones scared Ethan, but he couldn't take his eyes off the scene. Something about the man's pain felt real, even to Ethan. It wasn't just anger. It was hurt. "You think you're so wise, don't you?" the man said bitterly. "But people like you don't understand real suffering. You hide behind your money and your pretty words." Leonard's expression softened even more. "Money doesn't make life perfect," he said. "It's kindness that matters in the end. If you're hurting, let me help. Tell me your story." For a brief moment, the man hesitated. His shoulders slumped slightly, and the anger in his face seemed to flicker, replaced by something else. Doubt, or perhaps exhaustion. But then he shook his head, his fists tightening again. "No one can help me," the man said sharply. "Not anymore." Ethan felt his chest tighten. He wanted to scream, to tell Mr. Leonard to run, to warn him that something wasn't right. But his voice wouldn't come out. He felt frozen, powerless to do anything but watch. Leonard stayed calm, his voice steady and gentle. "Sometimes we think no one cares," he said. "But that's not true. You don't have to carry your burden alone." The man's eyes darted away, as if he couldn't look Leonard in the eye. "You don't get it," he whispered. "You'll never understand." Ethan's small hand gripped Max's leash tightly as the man's words hung in the air. Time seemed to slow, and Ethan's young mind raced. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew he couldn't look away. Something inside him told him this moment would change everything. For Mr. Leonard, for the man, and for himself. The peaceful night on the bridge was no longer peaceful. It had become a place where decisions were made and consequences followed. Ethan could only wait and see what would unfold. Ethan's small hands trembled as he held tightly to Max's leash. The man in the dark coat seemed trapped in his own emotions, his body tense and his eyes filled with a strange mix of anger and sadness. Mr. Leonard stood his ground, calm and steady, like a gentle lighthouse in the middle of a storm. The man stepped closer to Leonard, his voice rising. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" he said, his tone sharp. "Always looking down on people like me, acting like you're some kind of hero." Leonard shook his head, his voice soft but firm. "I've never looked down on anyone. We all have struggles, but we can choose how we face them." Ethan couldn't understand all of their words, but he could feel the tension growing stronger. The man's hands were shaking now, still stuffed deep in his coat pockets. He seemed to be battling something within himself, and Ethan wondered if the kind words from Leonard would make a difference, or if they'd be ignored completely. Max let out a low, soft whimper. Ethan froze, holding his breath, terrified that the sound might give away their hiding spot. He gently patted Max's head, silently pleading for his dog to stay quiet. The man didn't seem to hear the whimper, but Ethan felt his heart race as he continued watching. "I lost everything because of people like you," the man said, his voice cracking. "You don't know what it's like to have your life destroyed, to feel like nothing you do matters." Leonard took a step closer, his eyes filled with compassion. "I'm sorry for your pain," he said, "but carrying this anger will only hurt you more. Let me help. We can find a way forward together." The man clenched his fists tightly. For a moment, it looked like he might listen, like Leonard's words were beginning to reach him. His shoulders dropped slightly, and he looked away as though ashamed. "It's too late," he muttered. "No one can fix what's already broken." "It's never too late," Leonard replied, his voice steady. "No matter what you've been through, there's always a chance to start again." Ethan watched, his young heart filled with both fear and hope. Part of him believed Mr. Leonard's words, but another part of him couldn't ignore the tension in the man's movements. Something about him felt unpredictable, and Ethan wasn't sure what he would do next. The man's gaze returned to Leonard, and for a brief moment, his face softened. But then, as quickly as it came, the softness vanished. His fists unclenched, and he took a step back, shaking his head. "You don't get it," he said. "You'll never get it." Ethan's stomach twisted. He didn't know what the man was planning, but he knew it wasn't good. His small hands gripped Max's leash tightly, his mind racing. Should he run for help? Should he stay hidden? Every second felt heavier than the last. The night on the bridge was no longer calm. It had turned into a moment of choice, a moment that would change everything. Ethan could feel it in his bones, even if he didn't yet understand how. And as the man moved again, closer to the rail, Ethan braced himself for what was to come, hoping deep down that somehow things would turn out okay. The bridge seemed frozen in time as Ethan clutched Max's leash, his heart racing with fear and uncertainty. The man in the dark coat stood only a step away from Mr. Leonard, his emotions boiling over like a storm that couldn't be contained. Ethan didn't know what would happen next, but every part of him wanted to scream, to run, to do something to stop what he felt was about to unfold. Leonard, ever calm and composed, continued to hold his ground. "I know you're hurting," he said gently, "but hurting others won't take away your pain. Let's talk this through." The man's face twisted with frustration. "Talk," he spat. "Talking won't bring back what I've lost. Talking won't fix anything. Leonard didn't waver. It may not fix the past, he said, but it can change the future. Anger and blame will only hold you back. You're stronger than this. The man's hands shook as he stared at Leonard. For a moment, it looked like he might break down, like the words were reaching a part of him that hadn't been touched in years. But then his eyes hardened, and he shook his head. "No," the man said, his voice low and trembling. "You don't get to tell me what to do. You don't get to act like you understand." Ethan, watching from his hiding spot, felt tears welling up in his eyes. He didn't fully understand the man's pain, but he could see it clearly in his face. It wasn't just anger. It was deep, aching sadness. But it was also a sadness that scared Ethan, because it seemed ready to explode at any moment. The man took a step toward the edge of the bridge, his eyes darting between Leonard and the dark water below. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he realized what was happening. The man wasn't just angry, he was desperate. And desperate people could do dangerous things. "Don't make this choice," Leonard said, his voice firm but kind. "There's always another way. Let me help you." The man hesitated, his gaze flickering with uncertainty. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he turned his back to Leonard, staring out at the river. The sound of the rushing water seemed louder now, echoing in the stillness of the night. Ethan couldn't take it anymore. His small body shook with fear, but he knew he had to do something. He glanced at Max, who seemed to sense Ethan's distress. Taking a deep breath, Ethan stood up slowly, his legs trembling beneath him. He wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he couldn't just sit and watch. Before Ethan could take a step, the man turned back to Leonard, his face filled with raw emotion. "You think you can save me?" he said, his voice breaking. "You can't." Leonard reached out a hand, his expression calm and steady. "You're not alone," he said. "Let me show you that." Ethan held his breath, his heart pounding as the moment teetered on a knife's edge. He prayed silently that Leonard's words would be enough, that the night would end without tragedy. But deep down, he wasn't sure if hope would be enough to change what was about to happen. The bridge felt colder now, the night air heavy with tension. Ethan stood frozen near the tree, his small hands gripping Max's leash as he tried to make sense of what was happening. He could see the man's shoulders trembling, his hands still clenched into fists. Mr. Leonard remained calm, standing tall but with a gentle expression that seemed almost unshakable. The man in the dark coat took a shaky step closer to Leonard, his voice breaking as he spoke. "You think your words mean anything to me? You think you can erase everything I've been through?" Leonard's voice remained steady, like a soothing current against the chaos. "I can't erase your pain," he said, his tone filled with understanding. "But you don't have to carry it alone. There's always another way." The man's eyes darted back and forth, like he was wrestling with a storm inside his mind. His breathing grew heavier, and for a moment, Ethan thought he might walk away. But instead, the man slammed his fist against the bridge rail, the sound echoing in the quiet night. "No one ever helped me," the man yelled, his voice shaking. "No one cared when I lost everything. Why should I believe you're any different?" Ethan's heart ached as he watched the scene unfold. He didn't know the full story, but he could feel the man's pain. It was raw, sharp, and overwhelming. Even though Ethan was only a child, he understood what it felt like to be alone. He glanced at Max, who looked up at him with trusting eyes, and Ethan squeezed the leash tightly, trying to find courage. Leonard took a careful step closer to the man. "I won't pretend to understand everything you've been through," he said, "but I know this, you're stronger than you think. You're still here, still fighting, even if it feels like the world has turned against you." The man turned to Leonard, his face filled with anger and sorrow. "And what about you?" he said bitterly. "What do you know about loss? Have you ever had everything ripped away from you?" Leonard hesitated for a moment, his gaze dropping to the ground. When he looked up again, There was a deep sadness in his eyes. "I have," he said softly. "I lost my wife to illness. I lost my son in an accident. I've known pain that I thought would never go away." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. He had always seen Mr. Leonard as the cheerful old man who waved at everyone and gave cookies to kids during the holidays. Hearing about his losses made him see Leonard in a new light. Even someone as kind and strong as him had known suffering. "But I learned something," Leonard continued. "Pain doesn't have to define you. It can teach you to appreciate what you still have and to help others who are hurting." The man's expression faltered. For the first time, he looked uncertain, as if Leonard's words had reached a part of him he had been trying to ignore. He stepped back from the rail, his hands falling to his sides. Ethan held his breath. Was the man going to listen? Was Mr. Leonard's kindness enough to stop whatever was about to happen? The night felt fragile, like one wrong move could shatter it completely. Max nudged Ethan's hand, and Ethan whispered softly, "Please, let this end okay." The man stood still, staring at Leonard, his face a mixture of emotions that even Ethan couldn't understand. The tension in the air didn't break, but something felt different, as if hope had found a way into the man's heart, even if just for a moment. The bridge was silent except for the sound of the river below. Ethan's small hands shook as he held Max's leash, his young heart pounding. From his hiding spot, he watched as the man in the dark coat stood frozen, his expression shifting from anger to confusion. Mr. Leonard didn't move closer this time. He simply stood still, his calm presence like a steady light in the darkness. "You say pain doesn't have to define me," the man muttered, almost to himself. "But what else is there? When everything is gone, when no one cares, what's left?" Leonard's voice was gentle, yet firm. "Hope," he said. "Even in the darkest moments, there's always a chance to start again. You just have to be willing to take it." The man let out a bitter laugh. "Hope? What good is hope when the world keeps tearing you down?" "It's not easy," Leonard admitted, "but giving up means letting the world win. And I don't believe you're someone who gives up so easily." Ethan felt a strange sense of admiration for Leonard. Even in this tense moment, he spoke with such kindness, such belief in the man before him. It was like Leonard saw something good in him, something worth saving, even if the man couldn't see it himself. The man turned away from Leonard and stared out at the river. His shoulders sagged, and for the first time that night, he looked tired, exhausted, even. "You make it sound so simple," he said quietly. "But it's not. It's never been simple." "I never said it was," Leonard replied. "But the hardest battles are the ones worth fighting." Ethan's breath hitched as he watched the man's hands loosen at his sides. He wasn't clenching his fists anymore. The tension in his posture seemed to ease, just a little. Ethan dared to hope that maybe, just maybe, Leonard's words were getting through to him. "You don't even know me," the man said, his voice softer now. "Why do you care?" Leonard smiled faintly. "Because everyone deserves a second chance," he said. "And because I've been where you are. I know how it feels to think the world is against you. But you're not alone, not as long as there are people willing to help." The man turned back to Leonard, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the two men stood there in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. Ethan clutched Max's leash tighter, his heart racing as he waited to see what would happen next. Then something unexpected happened. The man took a step back from the rail. His hands, once trembling with anger, hung limply at his sides. He let out a shaky breath and looked down at the ground. "I don't know if I can believe you," he said, "but maybe I want to." Leonard nodded, his smile growing warmer. "That's a start," he said, "and it's enough for now." Ethan's heart swelled with relief. He could feel the shift in the air, the tension beginning to fade. Max wagged his tail softly, as if sensing the change too. For the first time that night, hope felt real. The man glanced at Leonard, his expression unsure but calmer. "What do I do now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Leonard placed a hand on his shoulder. "You take one step at a time," he said, "and you let people help you." Ethan exhaled slowly, his small body relaxing. The night wasn't over yet, but for the first time, it felt like things might be okay. The man stood there, staring at Leonard with uncertainty. His shoulders, once tense and defensive, now sagged as if the weight of the world had finally begun to lift. Ethan, still watching from his hiding spot, felt a flicker of relief but didn't dare move. His young heart was still racing, and his hands clutched Max's leash tightly. "You really believe I can change?" the man asked, his voice low, almost unsure. Leonard nodded with a kind smile. "I do. It's not about where you've been or what you've done. It's about what you choose to do now. Everyone deserves a chance to start over." The man glanced away, his gaze falling to the flowing river beneath the bridge. "It's not that easy," he muttered. "I've made mistakes. Big ones. I don't even know if I can fix them." Leonard's voice remained steady and reassuring. "You don't have to fix everything overnight. Change happens one small step at a time. But you have to take that first step." The man fell silent, lost in thought. Ethan watched closely, his small fingers gripping the bark of the tree for support. Even at his young age, he could tell this was a turning point, a moment where everything could go one way or the other. Finally, the man took a deep breath and turned to face Leonard. "What if I don't know how?" he asked, his voice trembling with vulnerability. "What if I'm too far gone?" Leonard's kind eyes met his. "You're not," he said firmly. "And you don't have to do it alone. There are people who care, people who can help. You've already taken the hardest step, admitting you want something to change." The man blinked, as if trying to hold back tears. He rubbed his hands over his face and shook his head. "I don't even know where to start," he said. "Start here," Leonard said, spreading his arms to indicate the bridge, the moment they were sharing. "You've already shown courage by staying and listening. Let this be your first step forward." Ethan felt a warmth spread through his chest. He didn't fully understand everything Leonard was saying, but it felt right. It felt good. Even Max seemed calmer now, wagging his tail gently, as if sensing the shift in the air. The man hesitated but finally nodded, his movements slow and uncertain. "I don't know if I can believe in myself yet," he admitted, "but maybe. I can try." Leonard smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling with quiet pride. "That's all anyone can ask for," he said. "Trying is the first step toward believing." For the first time, the man straightened his posture. He didn't look so angry anymore, nor as defeated. There was still hesitation in his eyes, but there was also something new, something Ethan couldn't quite name. Maybe it was hope. Ethan let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The bridge, once heavy with tension, felt lighter now. The night sky above seemed brighter, the stars twinkling gently as if they, too, were watching this moment unfold. Leonard reached out a hand. "Come on," he said. "Let's get off this bridge and figure out the next step together." The man stared at Leonard's hand for a moment before finally shaking it. "Okay," he said quietly. "Okay." Ethan smiled from his hiding spot, feeling a small sense of pride. Though he hadn't spoken or moved, he knew he had been part of something important. And as the two men began to walk off the bridge, Ethan stayed still, his heart full of hope for what would come next. Ethan stayed hidden as he watched Mr. Leonard and the man in the dark coat walk slowly toward the other side of the bridge. The air, once tense and heavy, felt calm now. Ethan's young heart, which had been racing moments ago, finally began to settle. Max, his loyal dog, wagged his tail softly, as if sensing that the danger had passed. The two men reached the end of the bridge and paused. Leonard placed a comforting hand on the man's shoulder and spoke quietly. Ethan couldn't hear the words, but he saw the man nod. There was still hesitation in his movements, but it looked like he was beginning to trust Leonard's kindness. Ethan smiled to himself. He felt proud of Mr. Leonard, and even of the man who had seemed so angry and lost. A part of him wanted to run out and tell Leonard how brave he was, but he stayed hidden. This moment wasn't his to interrupt. The man turned to Leonard one last time. "I don't know what's next," he said, loud enough for Ethan to hear. "But thank you for not giving up on me." Leonard smiled warmly. "None of us can do it alone," he said. "You've taken the first step, and that's what matters." The man nodded, his face showing a mix of emotions: relief, fear, and perhaps even a hint of hope. Then, with a final glance at Leonard, he walked away, disappearing into the quiet streets beyond the bridge. Ethan felt a strange sense of peace. The man hadn't been bad, Ethan realized. He had just been lost, and Leonard had helped him find a little light in his darkness. It was something Ethan would never forget. Leonard stood on the bridge for a moment longer, gazing out at the river. Ethan thought about stepping out to talk to him, but before he could decide, Leonard turned and began walking back toward his home. His steps were steady, his posture calm. Ethan knew Leonard had done something important that night, even if most people would never know about it. As Leonard disappeared into the distance, Ethan stepped out from his hiding spot with Max by his side. He felt the cool night air on his face and looked up at the stars. The world felt different now, brighter, maybe, or more hopeful. Ethan knelt down and patted Max's head. "He did it, Max," he said softly. He helped him. Max wagged his tail and licked Ethan's hand, as if agreeing. Ethan stood up and began walking home, his small footsteps echoing on the quiet street. He knew his parents would be upset that he had snuck out, but he also knew he had witnessed something extraordinary tonight. It was a story he would carry with him forever. When Ethan finally reached home and crawled into bed, he stared at the ceiling, replaying the events of the night in his mind. He didn't understand everything, but he knew one thing for sure. Kindness had the power to change people. Mr. Leonard had proved that. And as he drifted off to sleep, Ethan silently promised himself that one day he would try to be like Leonard, a person who helped others, even when it wasn't easy. The world, he thought, needed more people like him.